For those who don't know me, my name is Kevin O'Brien. I serve across the campuses of Village as sort of the utility reliever for the preaching team when somebody is unavailable. Again, happy Mother's Day. It seems kind of appropriate that I'm here today because Pastor Jeremy and Sabrina had a new baby this week. And you can be praying for them too because a stomach bug is going through their house. I learned this morning. So, over time, preachers learn that there are about 4 special weeks a year that no matter what, you got to prepare for. And very early on, you realize and learn how to preach a Christmas sermon, how to preach an Easter sermon. But there are 2 other sermons, 2 other weeks that ironically are not really spiritual at all. They are 19th century inventions that every preacher is going to have to deal with. And those are Mother's Day and Father's Day, right? And the joke among preachers goes something like this: Mother's Day sermons, moms are great. Father's Day sermons, do better. Okay? That's kind of the way it works. And Mother's Day, as being old enough now that I've gone through, just in my own family, 7 of them, I guess, 28, getting older, you realize that it's not always the happy occasion that you might wish for. How hard was it to get to church this morning for some of you with younger ones? Maybe there are issues of infertility or estrangement or feeling like you don't now or didn't measure up. And to be honest, I'm not here this morning to either cheerlead or browbeat, but to encourage and exhort all of us to live as Christ wants us to live. And to be perfectly honest, I got a text Tuesday night from Jeremy about preaching today. And he said, hey, could you preach on Sunday? And I said yes before I thought about either the passage from our sermon series or what today was, because I was watching an NHL playoff game. So it wasn't connecting with me. And then I read today's passage and I thought, oh, this is going to go over well. So we are today in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Verses 1 to 15. And this is what Paul says. I wish you would put up with a little foolishness from me. Yes, do put up with me, for I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, because I have promised you in marriage to one husband to present a pure virgin to Christ. But I fear, as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your minds may be seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if a person comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we did not preach, or you receive a different spirit, which you had not received, or a different gospel, which you had not accepted, you put up with it splendidly. Now, I consider myself in no way inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am untrained in public speaking, I am certainly not untrained in knowledge. Indeed, we have in every way made it clear to you in everything. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by taking pay from them to minister to you. When I was present with you and in need, I did not burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. I have kept myself and will keep myself from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows I do. But I will continue to do what I am doing in order to deny an opportunity to those who want to be regarded as our equals in what they boast about. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is of no great surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will be according to their works. Now there's a Mother's Day passage for you. Before we dive into it, would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for your church, for this morning, this Mother's Day, and for all of the mothers that we have and we support and what they have done for us. And I pray this morning as we look at this passage, we will see both who you are and how to live in light of who you are. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. The more I thought about this passage, the more I studied it, the more convinced I became that even though it doesn't feel like a Mother's Day passage, there is no example to follow, there is no exhortation in the ways that we normally think about it. The more I looked at it, the more I thought this might actually be the perfect Mother's Day passage, and one that also applies to dads and aunts and uncles and grandparents and friends and all of the rest of us. Because this passage, which at once continues Paul's defense of his own ministry, and it's also a plea to the church in Corinth, who are his spiritual children, to recognize who he is and what he's about, not for his own sake, but precisely because of them, his children. And that's what any parent, what every mother does. So this morning I want you to keep two thoughts in mind as we go through this passage. First is that Paul is demonstrating his role towards this church that he loves and which is sorely trying him, not unlike, say, a difficult toddler or a rebelling teenager. And second, that the ways that Paul interacts or thinks about his relationship with Corinth are not entirely unlike the relationships that we as parents have with our children. And a couple of weeks ago, Pastor Jeremy looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and he recounted all of the things that have gone on in 2 Corinthians up to this point. And I'm not going to do that today, but he started in chapter 10, Paul does, his defense of his ministry against these super apostles that we're going to meet in verse 5. And he contrasts his humility with boasting, ending with this verse in chapter 17, or verse 17 of chapter 10. So let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, for it is not the one commending himself who is approved, but the one the Lord commends. Now, some background. If you remember, Corinth is a large and influential city in Greece in the Roman Empire. It is a center of culture and commerce, intellect and influence. And in Acts chapter 18, we learn how Paul founds this church and spends 18 months there. And both 1st and 2nd Corinthians show us how, for all of the love and affection that Paul has with this church, their relationship is stormy at best. And at the time of 2 Corinthians, things are somewhat better. Chapter 7 and 8 tell us that Titus, one of Paul's co-workers, had sent a good report about Corinth. However, there is a group who are not so enamored with Paul. They think Paul does not measure up. And today, as Paul continues his defense of his ministry, he does so by way of a direct comparison between himself and his opponents. He offers what you might want to call a challenge to the cool parents. And he does so by beginning to emulate those same opponents to show their foolishness. He's kind of the first century equivalent of the dad on TikTok embarrassing his daughter for bad behavior by dressing or acting like her very publicly. Or perhaps calling out his son in front of the girl he likes for doing really dumb stuff. So he says in verse 1, put up with a little foolishness. Bear with me. That's what he's doing here. He's about to go over the top with them and wants them to know that's what he's doing. He's making it obvious. And he starts out slow in our passage today and kicks into high gear next week. But Paul does this. He is willing to go to this extreme to do the things that he would normally never do because these super apostles are essentially the friends who are dragging his kids down. And Paul shows the church, it's all right. I feel the same way sometimes. Paul shows the Corinthian church 3 interrelated responsibilities of being a spiritual parent to the church that he planted. And it starts in verses 2 to 4 by being committed to chaperone virtue. Now, a chaperone is not exactly a glamorous job. The role is keep things above board. No inappropriate touching, no substances that shouldn't be in the punch. You get the idea, right? But that's effectively what Paul calls himself here. In verses 2 to 4, he paints a picture. I am the father of the bride, Paul says. And not just any bride, but one that is in grave danger of being seduced by someone other than her fiancé, drawn away from the marriage that is imminent. And the seducer is a deceiving snake. Happy Mother's Day, right? That's exactly what we wanted to think about this morning. But, we think about it, in our world, when you think about the world of weddings and marriages, it's mom who is closest to daughter usually. When it comes to all of the things, the confidant, the organizer, the encourager, the one who makes sure that the relationship is okay. But in Paul's day, dad was guardian of the girl's virtue, her purity. And I know that sounds old-fashioned, out of touch, but there were very real social consequences at stake. Family and personal honor. You see, it was more than the connection of 2 people. Money, alliances, it was a social contract between families. It could secure the future for not just those 2, but for many, many people. And if that marriage was violated before it even got started, the consequences could be dire. And Paul is saying that's in danger of happening to the church at Corinth with these false teachers. It's what is so often at stake with our own kids. Let me give you 4 A's to stake out what's happening. It's not in your outline, so you can add these. And the first of those is affection. Paul says he is jealous with a godly jealousy. And jealousy, and to our way of thinking, is almost always a negative emotion. But even when it's out of bounds, it's a signal that something in a relationship is off. And Paul's jealousy is not wrong. It is exactly what he ought to have for his child, for the Corinthian church who has been pledged to Christ, the groom. I found an interesting quote as I was looking at things this week. John Chrysostom was the bishop of Constantinople in about 398 AD, a long time ago. And he said this, Paul uses a word here which is far stronger than mere love. Jealous souls burn ardently for those whom they love, and jealousy presupposes a strong affection. Then, in order that they should not think that Paul is after power or wealth or honor, he adds that his jealousy is divine. For God is said to be jealous, not in a human way, but so that everyone may know that he claims sovereign rights over those whom he loves and does what he does for their exhaustive benefit. Human jealousy is basically selfish, but divine jealousy is both intense and pure. So Paul's affection for the church at Corinth, what our affection for our own kids should be, is God's affection for his own people. In the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, God calls himself a jealous God. And a few chapters later in Exodus 34, Moses says that God's very name, his nature, is jealous. And that's the kind of jealousy Paul has, the kind of affection Paul has for the church at Corinth. The kind of jealousy that any parent, every mom, has for her kids. Right? And beyond that affection, beyond that, there is also direction. There is ambition. Paul says he wants to present them, the church at Corinth, purely to Christ, set apart to him, the groom. And that tells us that first, Paul is not in this for himself. Think about it. He has implicitly put a limit on his role in the Corinthians' lives, on his own position, his own influence. Yes, he's a father, but the father's role has an end goal. He doesn't go away, but he's not the groom. Christ is. And the super apostles that we meet in verse 5 are in it for the influence, for the notoriety, for the power. They are in it for themselves. Paul, like any good parent, like any good mom, is not in it for themselves. He's in it for the benefit of his kid. Second, purity matters. Wholeness, set apartness. In a world that says to us, do what you want, when you want, how you want, purity seems quaint at best, perhaps silly, or downright wrong at worst. But ask a young person today about the dating scene. How's the world of hookups and situationships and everything that goes with it working out? Our kids, my kids' age, are reaping the consequences of that way of looking at things. And purity matters for the well-being of the individual, and it matters when it comes to the marriage that most of us one day seek. And the implication that Paul is making is the marriage is in jeopardy. He doesn't want that for either his children or for the groom. And that's the sign of a spiritual parent who has his or her heart set in the right direction. And Paul's attitude, his affection, and his ambition for his children are there because he knows his adversary. The serpent, he says, who tempted Eve by deceit and cunning. And that's the nature of the seducer. The one who takes a person away from their love. It is the setup to how many romance novels, TV shows, movies. It's the plot line for tell-all podcasts and reels on every form of social media. And there is a reason that Paul says he is worried that they are being seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ, because it happens all the time. It is the basis of the plot to one of the most famous and loved movies around, The Notebook. It starts with cheating. Because the bad guy doesn't show up twirling his mustache, laughing maniacally, wearing a black t-shirt that says, "I'm the bad guy." He's a spiritual deceiver. Looks good, smells good, sounds good. But he wants the church's virtue for his own gain, not because he loves them. And that is the danger that Paul, not unlike a mother telling her daughter, "Watch out, I know his type," he sees it. Mom says he's going to take advantage of you and leave you behind and broken because she's seen it before. And it's not simply a romantic notion, because we've all seen the friends of children who take them down the wrong path. Maybe we were the person taking them down a wrong path, or the person being taken down a wrong path. And a parent, spiritual, physical, has to be on guard to know the adversary, because there is always an aftermath. Deceivers always leave an aftermath. We like to think there are no consequences, do what you want. But every parent knows the payment will come due. Paul says that these snakes, these super apostles who sound good, are actually preaching a different Jesus, leading to a different spirit and a different gospel. And it's important for us to understand that, because many people today preach Jesus using nice, right-sounding words and phrases. They're eloquent, but twist who Jesus was and what he taught mostly by what they leave out. And some portray Jesus as loving and forgiving in a way that destroys what loving and forgiving actually mean. Because their Jesus never calls people to account, never demands repentance. And that's not the Jesus we find in the Gospels. That's not the Jesus that Paul preaches. Jesus absolutely loves us, absolutely forgives us. He came to reconcile us to the Father. But that reconciliation, as we have seen all throughout 2 Corinthians, is a reconciliation that cannot excuse or leave us alone in our sin, because we must be pure before the groom. On the other side, there are others who preach a Jesus who is strong. And the Corinthians wanted a Jesus who would give them power and prestige, a Jesus who is strong and would not ever suffer. And we're not so different. We often want a Jesus who sounds far more like Maximus in Gladiator, with his salute, strength, and honor. And both of those are good things. But Jesus suffers with us and for us. And too often, like the Corinthian church, we are susceptible to being seduced by a Jesus who conquers with overwhelming force, not through sacrificial love. And both sides twist who Jesus is, make him ironically both less loving, less forgiving, and less strong. Because as Jesus himself says in John 16, look, grief is coming. And then in verse 33 says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And when we distort Jesus, when we preach a different Jesus, there's a cascade effect, like dominoes falling. We receive a different spirit, not the Holy Spirit that Jesus earlier in John 16 calls our advocate. The Spirit of truth who glorifies Christ and proves the world wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment. And when we as parents allow wrong messages to seduce our children away from Christ, it is no wonder that trouble follows. Now, to be clear, as Jesus said, trouble will come regardless. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind? Is it good trouble? It's not an easy path, but it is the path that Paul has been called to, the path that every parent, spiritual parent, every mother has been called to. And that commitment to chaperone virtue means that we must, second, consistently counter the cultural values of our time and space, verses 5 to 11. In verse 5, Paul makes his confrontation plain. His adversaries, whom he very ironically names super apostles, have made it clear that they think Paul is inferior. Inferior to them, to their gospel, to their spirit, to their Jesus. They present a more culturally acceptable Christianity, one that brings prestige and position. It is the cry, frankly, of the disaffected middle schooler who thinks their parent is completely uncool. Unlike Becky's mom, who lets her do whatever her wants, or Chad's parents who don't care if he does that, Paul is having none of it. He addresses two areas that have become flashpoints in Corinth because they represent two significant cultural touchpoints for the Corinthians. Cultural touchpoints that matter to us today still. Let's call the first one presentation. Verse 6. The charge. Paul, you are unskilled, untrained as a public speaker. He is not the dynamic preacher that his opponents are. They are eloquent and persuasive. They can turn a phrase without thinking about it. They are, let's call them, a less crass version of Eminem in a rap battle, able to depose, dethrone, and diss his opponents. And Paul is the young Marshall Mathers in Lose Yourself. He keeps forgetting what he wrote down. The whole crowd goes so loud. He opens his mouth, but the words won't come out. He's choking how everybody's joking now. That's what they think of Paul, the story they're telling. It's the story we generally hear about Paul. He wasn't a good speaker. He couldn't get up here and do it well. There are way more interesting and compelling speakers to be found on podcasts and platforms other than his. The word for unskilled here is idiotes. And yes, it's where we get the word idiot. But it doesn't mean dumb. It usually means somebody who lacked expertise or training in a specific area, which is why the new guy on the job site often hears idiot many times a day. Or the new mom feels dumb because she hasn't done it before, right? But there is another possibility to this term. Perhaps Paul is saying something like this: you say I can't speak, don't sound like you, don't play like you. I say you don't think. I know what I know. I act the fool just like you. Now you can't hear the truth. He's doing what he's doing to prove their foolishness. You see, often trained orators in the first century, these teachers of rhetoric, used their considerable skills to deceive, defraud, and trick their audiences. They were the slick sales guys who had an investment that just couldn't miss. And so another way that a person could be an idiotes was to be somebody who was trained but refused to use their skills for personal gain. And that is exactly what Paul did. He chose not to speak like them, not to be like them. The parent who tries too hard to be cool becomes cringe, right? And for the record, I proved that I fit into that camp because I hate that phrase. It should be cringy because grammar. That's just me. Those parents lose the ability to be heard, right? Because they're trying too hard. But every once in a while, just like Paul, the sarcastic use of cool shows just how foolish it is. I gotta admit, as a card-carrying member of Generation X, sarcasm is my love language, so I love that Paul does this. Because what is he doing? He's showing just how much this how this put on detracts from the truth, the values that matter, the values of Christ. And it's been said that what we win people with is what we win people to. And if it's all flash and all eloquence and the best speakers and the best music and the best, guess what happens? When you don't keep up, people are going to wander. So Paul doesn't do that because sometimes the message is the medium, and if he goes all the way down their path, preaching the gospel in a way that is so caught up with the culture's values, it will be compromised. Full stop. Now that's not an excuse to not try to be heard by whatever culture we're in. We have to be able to communicate. And Paul is not opposed to good speaking. In 1 Corinthians, there is a controversy in the church. Camps of Paul and Apollos and Peter. And Apollos, we meet in Acts chapter 17, was a very gifted speaker. And Paul goes out of his way in 1 Corinthians to make it clear that Paul and Apollos are on the same side, that they are together examples about not boasting. And Apollos ends up leaving the church in Corinth, going elsewhere because people were elevating him because of his rhetorical skill, not because of Christ. So why is Paul boasting now? To show them the foolishness of the practice that they have decided is the way to do ministry. Presentation isn't everything. And their elevation of what happens on the platform has undermined the message of the crucified Christ. That way of doing things, of looking for the person who can move crowds, is directly connected to the second problem that Paul talks about. And that's patronage. You familiar with Patreon? You know, you subscribe to a podcast or a YouTube channel, probably a bunch of other platforms that I don't know about. And you pay something every month and you get special perks, maybe early access or exclusive content, or you get to buy some kind of merch. Essentially, you pay to support the creator. Congratulations, you know what patronage is. It's the same thing. Now, in the Roman world, it had very specific rules and ways things that happen, and it still survives a bit today. If you've ever watched the first Godfather movie, you have seen it in action. And it's not coincidental. Rome is in Italy, and that's about the Italian mafia. A patron, usually a wealthy Roman citizen, would provide things for lower class individuals, legal protection, work, food, and their client would vote for, provide support for, or otherwise serve the interest of the patron. It was sort of a mutual loyalty network. And it was the way a good portion of Roman society worked. But in verse 7, we read, "Did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge?" You see, Paul didn't play by the rules. He didn't follow the rules of patronage. He humbled himself. And it's likely that Paul's opposition in Corinth comes from the elite members of the Corinthian church and society. Acts 18 tells us that Paul supported himself in Corinth by making tents. And let me tell you, that would have been beneath those members. They would have been embarrassed by it. Their apostle was blue collar, worked with hides, wouldn't take their money. No. Speakers get paid. They had patrons, and Paul isn't playing the game. We need someone better, someone who conforms to our way of doing things. In verses 8 and 9, Paul says it got worse. Not only did he not take the money of the wealthy Corinthians, he did take the money from the Macedonians. Guess what? They were poor. Acts 18:5 says that when Silas and Timothy come to Corinth from Macedonia, Paul starts to devote his entire time to preaching the word. In other words, they brought money and or supplies to the ministry. So why would Paul take money from them but not from Corinth? Well, this is Paul's boast, he says, turning their super apostles' boast on their head. He won't be bought. He will be supported by those who come alongside him in his ministry of reconciliation. Because a client isn't likely to call out their patron when they do something wrong, when they are captive to the culture's values, because their livelihood depends on it. A good spiritual parent can't let the cultural values of the day dictate how life is lived. A good mom doesn't bow to the values that her kids' friends espouse. Why? Verse 12 tells us. Not because we don't love them, but precisely because we do. And that leads us to the final point. A good spiritual parent will combat counterfeit voices. Verses 12 to 15. In verse 12, Paul says, I am not stopping. I am going to keep living these countercultural values consistently. Because if I don't do that, I will provide a way for these super apostles, these snakes, these seducers to gain a foothold. This year, this spring, my backyard is being overgrown by creeping Charlie. I hate creeping Charlie. I had gotten rid of most of it, but in the last couple of years, due to several circumstances, it's coming back. Largely infiltrating from 2 of my neighbors' yards. It's invasive. It moves quick. It has to be poisoned more than once. It has to be pulled out. You have to be consistent. Because if you don't, you're going to get overwhelmed. Combat doesn't always mean a full-out assault. It doesn't mean fighting using the enemy's methods. It means consistently living counter to the cultural values, living Christ's countercultural values. And you root out counterfeits by knowing the real thing. Because counterfeits are everywhere. And some of them are obvious, and we tend to focus a lot of time and energy on those counterfeits, but they aren't the real dangers. The counterfeits we don't recognize, they're the ones that get us into trouble. They lull us to sleep until it's too late. And Paul began this passage with a serpent that deceived Eve. And he ends it with an angel of light. Same seducer. And he calls those super apostles, those ones that look good, sound good, the servants of the angel of light. No wonder, he says, they disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. And I was thinking about this, and a song came into my head as the perfect example of this. So you're going to have to indulge me for a moment and step into the Wayback Machine to 1981 and the band Petra. But I know your devices. It shouldn't seem odd. You lied from the beginning. I see through your facade. Angel of light, I see you glow in the night, but you only bring darkness to my soul. Angel of light, you're telling me wrong is right. I won't let your evil take control. This is the last verse, and it is chilling to me. You got the clergy working overtime to widen the narrow way. You've got politicians everywhere listening to what you say. You've got false apostles teaching lies, perverting the only way. You've got principalities and powers waiting to obey. You've got philosophies and vain deceits, lying to deceive. You've got hate and greed, ungodly lusts in the deadly web you weave. Somehow, you've got so many thinking you're not even there. One look is all it takes to get them blinded by your glare. I couldn't very well let Eminem have the last musical word in a sermon. And I've got serious electric guitars that sound a lot like Foreigner or Boston in my head because of that song. But the counterfeits are always there. They're always going to come in. There are plenty powerful, persuasive. And we have to be on guard because they're going to do their best to seduce us, to seduce our children. And we have to live consistently counterculturally in the way of Christ. Because as Paul says, the truth of Christ is in me. When we live that way, we are consumed by his truth. And then we can better combat these counterfeits. We can present ourselves, our church, our kids pure before Christ. That's Paul's goal. It's the reason why he was willing to defend himself from frankly silly accusations. It's the reason every parent, every mom has to ask her kids, bear with me at some point. I have something important to share with you. I have something important to do. I have responsibilities here. So at the end of the day, it's not about guilt trips or unattainable examples, but it is a challenge for us all. Are we willing to be responsible in the way Christ calls us to? It's a challenge, yes, for the moms, but not just for the moms, for all of us, young and old, whether we think things are just beginning or time has passed us by. That's what a true spiritual parent does.